Every mystery has a voice. Few dare to listen.
There were those in the county of Northshire who still maintained, rather sentimentally in the opinion of Lord Peter Wimsey, that Oxford Hall had never been the same since Colonel Hargreaves returned from India with his curious fondness for Eastern rugs, uncommon religion, and a wine cellar so aggressive that guests were frequently forced into prolonged recoveries. The hall was an old Jacobean structure that had spent the past 2 centuries dozing comfortably behind a pair of beach-lined drives, tolerating luncheon parties and the occasional scandal with equal indifference. Its only remarkable feature, so the villagers said, was the stone bell tower, standing like a stern governess at the rear of the estate, nearest the family chapel and farthest from the servants' wing, which fact was either architectural negligence or deliberate design, depending on whom you asked. At 7:30 on a June evening, whose tranquil civility seemed almost offensively English, a single bell toll rang out from that tower, a low, heavy sound, neither cracked nor ceremonial, but exceedingly final. Mrs. Dudley, the housekeeper, swore afterward that she had been polishing the silver at that precise moment and dropped a salver at the sound out of a presentiment of doom. The groom heard it too while oiling a saddle. The cook heard it above the indignation of a soufflé, and the vicar heard it across the meadow beside the ewes. Nearly everyone who heard it claimed, with admirable unanimity, that they had felt something rather than merely heard it. 10 minutes later, Colonel Arthur Hargreaves, late of the Bengal Cavalry, highly decorated, admirable swordsman, deplorable conversationalist, was discovered dead in his study, face down across his escritoire, a decanter toppled at his elbow, and a curious blue-black discoloration at the edges of his mouth. The servants swore it must have been his heart. The vicar murmured sobriety about mysterious visitations. The cook, who had a healthy suspicion of Providence, said quite firmly it was poison and that Providence could go hang. Only the butler, a gaunt and reverent figure named Chillingford, stated with awful certainty, before anyone thought to ask him, that the bell's toll was no natural thing. No one at that point had summoned Lord Peter Wimsey. But fate, having a soft spot for mischief, arranged the matter with a neatness of which even the most efficient parlour-maid might have been proud. A lord appears at the inconvenient moment. Wimsey had not intended to call upon Oxford Hall. He was in Northshire only because Bunter, his confidential valet, photographic archivist, and general prophylactic against disarray, had discovered a 17th-century folio advertised by a clerical widow with no idea of its worth. Wimsey, whose vices included a bibliophilic acquisitiveness matched only by his capacity for champagne, thought it advisable to examine the artifact before some frightful American millionaire got hold of it and had it restored into obliteration. He took rooms at the King's Arms in Netherbury, only for a night, as he told himself, and was sitting contentedly over a trout soufflé when a breathless stable boy arrived to fetch the local physician. "The Colonel, sir. He's gone dreadful queer." The usual flutter ensued. The doctor departed at once. Half the tap-room speculated that the Colonel had been dead 3 years already, and no one had noticed. Lord Peter, who habitually avoided the emotional displays of the freshly bereaved, might have carried on with the soufflé had the boy not added, in a solemn stage whisper entirely out of proportion to his age, "They says the bell tolled itself." Wimsey paused with a fork mid-flight. "No verger hanging about with a guilty conscience?" he inquired lightly. "No one near the tower at all, sir." Said Wimsey, and finished his bite. Self-tolling architecture is rarely in good taste. He was still amused by the notion when, no more than half an hour later, Dr. Atherton re-entered, pale, unfed, and thoroughly ruffled. "Heart failure?" asked the innkeeper helpfully. "Possibly," said the doctor, with a professional hesitation that was louder than any certainty. "Possibly, or comfortably unbelievable," murmured Wimsey. The doctor looked up sharply. Something wrong? I would not say wrong, Atherton answered, but there is a smell about it I do not like. Smell, said Wimsey, figuratively. Though, wait, no, he corrected himself. There was an odor, sharp, not brandy, something acrid. Wimsey's eyebrows arched delicately. One doesn't suppose, he said, that the bell rang to announce the aroma. That was enough. Within the hour, he was strolling the beach-lined drive toward the hall, hat angled rather jauntily, maintaining the mildly apologetic expression of a gentleman who introduces himself to a corpse before being invited. The study of the dead colonel. Hargreaves's study was a shrine to self-importance. Leather tomes unopened since Victoria, hunting trophies glowering from the walls, and a Bengal sabre hung at rakish angle above a massive oak escritoire, now guardian to its extinguished master. Wimsey stood over the body with that detached melancholy peculiar to men who have seen too many deaths, yet treat each one as a fresh philosophical puzzle. Dr. Atherton hovered nearby, feeling his judgment please no one, including himself. The butler, Chillingford, waited in funereal silence, like an undertaker rehearsing. No overturned chairs, Wimsey observed. No scratched floorboards, no spilled ink, only the brandy. Decanter not fully emptied, glass clean, and the window, closed, though the evening is warm. Was it open earlier? Chillingford inclined his head the solemn distance of half an inch. It has remained as you see it, my lord, I answered. The study bell myself, 10 minutes after the toll from the tower. Found the colonel thus, quite gone. 10 minutes, said Wimsey mildly. You are punctual. I listen sharply, my lord, said the butler without vanity. Wimsey drifted toward the escritoire, hands clasped behind his back. No papers disturbed. No note, no blotting pad overturned. He leaned closer. A curious tint about the lips. Doctor? Atherton cleared his throat. I cannot be satisfied it was natural. But the bell, said Wimsey softly, took no account of your uncertainty. A melodramatic timekeeper. Chillingford stiffened. My lord, the tower bell does not strike of itself. Well, evidently, said Wimsey cheerfully, it does so for the dead. Keeps a private engagement with them, no doubt. The supernatural has dreadful social habits, always showing up before one has time to offer its sherry. The doctor gave him a startled look, half scandalized, half intrigued. Wimsey smiled blandly. One gathers, he said, that the late colonel left behind a household full of impressions, though perhaps fewer facts. Bells rarely toll on sentiment. We must ask them, presently, for their habit and schedule. His tone grew lighter still. And since the colonel does not propose to assist, we must consult the living. Wimsey made a leisurely circuit of the room, the way another man might stroll through a conservatory of exotic orchids, pausing now and then to admire some oddity known only to himself. He neither questioned nor hurried. He simply absorbed. When he finally addressed Chillingford again, it was with an air of mild curiosity, like a gentleman wondering aloud why pigeons persist in existing. You heard both bells, he said. The toll from the tower, and then the study bell from the colonel? Yes, my lord. The first at 7:30, the second some minutes after. And you are quite certain, Wimsey went on pleasantly, that no one was near the tower when it rang? As certain as any man may be, replied the butler with a severity that suggested no one ought to be doubting him in the first place. The grounds were clear. The key to the tower rests in the vestry, under lock. Wimsey murmured. Locked towers are so cooperative about remaining unopened, except when they don't. He said it casually, almost idly, but Chillingford's jaw hardened by a shade. Wimsey let it pass. He preferred that people harden, rather like wet clay. One gleaned more from the firing process than the sculpting. Now, he said softly, the rest of the household. There was no objection. Households in shock are grateful for instruction, even when it is politely phrased as a request. The servants had gathered in the morning room under that particular hush which arises in great country houses when someone important has died. Not a hush of grief, but of anticipation, as though death were a visitor still loitering in the corridor. The housekeeper, Mrs. Dudley, was stout, officious, and in the first throes of dramatic rectitude. "A dreadful business, my lord," she declared, dabbing an entirely dry handkerchief to her eyes. "Though I cannot say I am surprised, not with the colonel's humours, nor with the bell tolling out of nowhere. Ominous from the first, that was." "My dear lady," said Wimsey gently, "bells are notorious extroverts. They insist upon being heard whether they have anything sensible to say or not." The housekeeper blinked at this, uncertain whether she had been comforted or corrected. "Did Colonel Hargreaves customarily ring for attendance about that hour?" Wimsey continued, his voice as careless as if inquiring about luncheon. "Sometimes," she conceded, "when his digestion troubled him." "Ah, and did it trouble him this evening?" "We could not say. He took dinner in the study. Again." This last was said with pious disapproval. "Cold mutton and a pudding. Cook sent it up on a tray." Wimsey looked faintly amused at the notion of cold mutton as officer-class indulgence. "And who carried it?" "Evelyn," she sniffed. "The parlour-maid." The girl in question sat very straight, very pale, and very nearly transparent. She had the look of a rabbit contemplating whether a gentleman's questions were merely inconvenient or fatal. "You gave it to him in person?" Wimsey asked. "Yes, my lord." Her voice was scarcely above a whisper. "He told me to leave it on the small table, by the window. He didn't look ill then, only vexed." "Vexed," Wimsey repeated lightly. "By dinner, the state of empire, or the behaviour of humanity?" She flushed. "He had a letter in his hand. He crumpled it up before I left. He looked angry." Said Wimsey, as though a man dying of internal fury were the most tedious thing imaginable. "And after you departed, did anyone else attend him?" "No, my lord, not until the bell was rung." Which bell, Wimsey did not specify, and it was interesting that no one asked. From the rear of the room a soft sniffling threatened to become a display. The cook, a broad woman who looked capable of throttling an ox with one hand and making pastry with the other, had taken it upon herself to provide a moral interpretation of proceedings. "I told him," she muttered darkly, "that living alone with your thoughts will do a man in sooner than rationing." "You speak philosophically," said Wimsey. "I speak from watching men die of manners," she returned. "Men who keep their doors shut and their tempers bottled. Something foul was brewing in that study. You can smell it from here." "Only faintly," said Wimsey. "And I think that is just the servant's polish." That earned a strangled snort from the groom, who tried to disguise it as a cough. Wimsey turned back to Chillingford. "No one entered." "No, one left. The colonel was alone from the delivery of his supper until his discovery. A clean, self-contained little tragedy, almost too neat." The butler did not answer. It was the silence of a man who knew something and intended never to say it. "And the bell," Wimsey continued conversationally, "is never rung by accident, by wind, by poorly secured rope. It is a weight-driven toll bell, my lord. It cannot sound without deliberate setting. So either the dead colonel rose from his supper to bid it toll for his own benefit," Wimsey mused, "or someone set his funeral rung for him." The servants shifted, uneasy. Mrs. Dudley crossed herself as though the Church of England would thank her for it. And through that discomfort, Wimsey observed, not the fear, but the distribution of fear, the housemaid afraid of something recent, the cook afraid of something inevitable, the housekeeper afraid of narrative disorder. Only Chillingford looked afraid of being caught. The detection did not begin with the death at all, Wimsey reflected, but with the bell and who wished it heard, which meant his next question was no longer who killed the colonel, but Who wanted him declared dead at 7:30 precisely? And why? Wimsey let the last of his questions settle into the hush like dust on sun-warmed furniture. There was nothing more to be gained from the servants, nothing they would say at least, and too much eagerness to say more would only teach them how to conceal better. One never harvested fruit by shaking the tree. One merely encouraged wind and time to do the work. He thanked them with an easy civility that made them all the more unnerved, then strolled out through the corridor, pausing only to trail a fingertip along a carved panel where a faint groove suggested repeated opening, habitual, secretive, not decorative. He said nothing, though the observation filed itself neatly alongside the bell, the supper tray, and the butler's curious vigilance about timings. Bunter, having acquired the instincts of a bloodhound and the manners of an archbishop, appeared at the threshold to the entrance hall with an expression of discreet alertness. "Examine the grounds, my lord," he murmured. "Tower door locked, no visible tampering. Keyhole dusty around the edges." "Ah," Wimsey replied softly. "So no one has unlocked it recently, or someone has been most obligingly thorough with a duster." "Yes, my lord." They stepped out into the fading light. Oxford Hall's lawns sloped gently toward the chapel grove, and the bell tower rose out of it like a warning finger. Old stone gone silver-grey under the evening. "Curious that our late colonel died with so many locked doors about him," Wimsey remarked. "One might suspect a hobby of his." "Or a fear, my lord." The chapel path was gravelled. Wimsey walked it slowly, testing the angles of approach. The bell tower door was, as Bunter had said, bolted and unmolested. There was a small arched window above, too narrow for entry, but not too narrow for someone to sound the bell if a very long cord were affixed inside. But there was no rope trailing from it, no sign of mischief, only the faint scent of cold stone and lilac from the evening hedges. Wimsey tilted his head, listening not to the silence, but to the wrongness inside it. "Bunter, what time had you the good fortune to hear the toll?" 29 minutes past the half-hour by my watch." "And the servants say past." Wimsey gave a faint, fox-like smile. "People always round up. Bells do not." Bunter waited. He knew his place in the sequence. Follow, observe, refrain from thinking aloud until invited. And if one wished for the death to be found at that exact moment, Wimsey mused, one would ring the tower bell, then wait a polite interval before pulling the study cord. Enough time for gravity to do its work. Suggesting, my lord, that someone knew the colonel was already dead, or was waiting for him to become so. There was no melodrama in the remark, only arithmetic. They returned toward the hall. On the terrace, a flicker of movement caught Wimsey's eye. A woman descending the inner staircase with the air of one who had been summoned unwillingly from her reflections. She was tall, elegant in a restrained, economical fashion, with dark eyes that revealed thought but not sentiment. Widowhood, Wimsey judged, sat on her not as tragedy, but as a mildly inconvenient alteration of routine. Mrs. Hargreaves, recently widowed and not apparently heartbroken, inclined her head with a grace that suggested she had been practicing composure since girlhood. "Lord Peter," she said evenly, "I take it you have been making inquiries." "Only of the household," he replied. The colonel was not conversational. Something flickered, just perceptibly behind her calm. "You were close to him?" Wimsey asked, almost idly. "I was his wife," she answered, which was neither a yes nor a confession of intimacy. "And is it your belief that he died of natural causes?" She hesitated. Too short a pause to be evasive. Too long to be instinctive. "I believe," she said carefully, "that Arthur was a man who carted unhappiness about with him like a trunk. India worsened the habit. A burdened trunk once packed is rarely reopened," Wimsey murmured. "And sometimes," she said with a faint narrowing of the eyes, "you do not wish to know what was packed inside." It was not grief that hardened her voice, but memory. He held her gaze a moment, reading, Not what she said, but what she declined to articulate. A woman who had long ago ceased to expect tenderness, a wife accustomed to silence, not from mourning, but from custom. "You did not go to him this evening?" Wimsey asked. "No." Her tone was final, impenetrable. Arthur preferred solitude with his brandy. "Ah, yes," Wimsey said lightly. "So many Englishmen do. One wonders that the Empire survives sobriety at all." She almost smiled, but not quite. "He had correspondence," Wimsey added, "a letter which vexed him." Her posture stiffened, not theatrically, but reflexively. "And you know the letter?" he asked. "I do not," she replied, too quickly, which told him she did, but not whether she feared its contents or its consequences. Someone, Wimsey now knew, had wanted the death noticed. Mrs. Hargreaves, however, looked like someone who preferred her husband's misfortunes unseen. She would not have tolled bells for them, which meant another hand, one not bound by marital fatigue, had intervened. "Thank you," he said gently, and let her go. He never pressed too hard on first approach. People confessed most fully, not under compulsion, but under the illusion of privacy. The darkness was rising. Lamps were being lit behind mullioned windows. "Bunter," Wimsey murmured, "we must know who hated the Colonel enough to mark his hour, and loved him enough to make certain it was witnessed." "Yes, my lord." "And tomorrow morning," Wimsey added, "we shall call upon the vicar. Anyone who lives in the shadow of a bell tower sooner or later develops an opinion about who ought to hear it." For now, the house slept uneasily around its secret. But secrets, Wimsey thought, are like ropes wound round a silent bell. Pull just once, and everything rings. The night at Oxford Hall settled into a hush that was all the more oppressive for being so impeccably mannered. Even the gravel seemed to soften its usual crunch beneath boot and heel, as though conspiring not to disturb the wrong intelligence. Wimsey retired only in theory. In practice, he sat in the modest guest chamber allotted to him, contemplating his cigarette at a contemplative angle while Bunter laid out a clean notebook, a lamp, and silence. "An obliging household," Wimsey murmured, "but not a forthcoming one. We have 3 varieties of withholding already: the housekeepers for drama, the cooks for suspicion, and the widows for history." "And the butler, my lord?" "Ah, his is the interesting sort. Not withholding, guarding. One doesn't stand between a truth and its hearers unless the truth has sharp corners." Bunter inclined his head in that infinitesimal bow, which meant he agreed but would not presume satisfaction. Wimsey exhaled a ribbon of smoke. "2 bells, Bunter. One to summon attention, and one to excuse intrusion. The toll, and then the call. Someone choreographed this little interval quite personally." "Yes, my lord. Which means the murder, if murder it is, was not merely done. It was announced." That was not anger in his voice, nor even moral reproach. It was recognition of design. Wimsey distrusted design in death the way a gardener distrusts roses in winter. Admirable, but unnatural. When he slept, it was briefly. By morning, the house was wrapped in that stiff propriety peculiar to freshly bereaved families. No one weeping, but everyone walking more quietly, as though reverence for the dead could be demonstrated by reduced shoe leather. Breakfast was a formal ceremony of porridge, eggs, and thick, unspoken sentiment. Mrs. Hargreaves did not appear. The only person who looked mildly improved by the Colonel's absence was the cat, who had installed itself in the main hall like a creature newly liberated from tyranny. Wimsey, having fortified himself with toast, ventured into the village ahead of Bunter, who followed at a discreet distance, carrying nothing more alarming than a notebook and the demeanour of a discreet archivist to the gentry. The vicarage sat opposite the churchyard, its garden overly fond of lilac and its roof resigned to ivy. The Reverend Mr. Markham was a lean, earnest clergyman with the haunted expression of one whose congregation insists on telling him things he never asked to know. He greeted Wimsey with all the warmth of a man too polite for refusal and too Anglican for panic. "You come about the bell," Markham said, before Wimsey had even removed his hat. "I come," Wimsey replied cheerfully, "about whichever of your parishioners has taken up prophecy as a hobby." The vicar sighed. "I wish the matter were as simple as a local eccentric." "Then perhaps it is complicated as a local eccentric," said Wimsey. "Tell me, has the tower been interfered with recently?" "Not to my knowledge," Markham said, but his hesitation was not lost on either gentleman. "The bell was rung last at Advent. The mechanism is quite functional, but only accessible from inside. The key is kept in the vestry, behind 2 locks. "2?" Wimsey asked lightly. "How very scriptural. Whatsoever thou shalt bind on earth." "Security," Markham amended too thinly. "And who holds the keys?" "I keep one," said the vicar. "The other is held by—" His pause was fatal. "Colonel Hargreaves." Wimsey's eyebrows rose with the leisurely grace of a curtain lifting in a well-paced drama. "So," he murmured, "a man may cause his own passing to be told, even from the grave, so long as he is the only one equipped to do so." "He has not opened that tower in months," Markham insisted, though he did not sound wholly persuaded. "Quite," said Wimsey. "And yet it tolled for him punctually at the hour of his death. How touching that a locked tomb should show such attentiveness." Markham pushed his fingers through his greying hair. "You imply deliberate symbolism." "My dear Reverend," Wimsey said gently, "bells are never rung without symbolism. They announce births, deaths, marriages, conflagrations, mass and imminent scandal. They are the extroverts of architecture, forever crying out someone else's business." The vicar winced. "Has the Colonel," Wimsey said softly, "ever been the subject of rumor linking him to that tower?" Markham hesitated too long. "There have been suggestions." "Such as?" "That he prayed there alone, that he performed private vigils. Some say he feared judgment, others—" He stopped. "Yes. Others say he went there to avoid it." Wimsey replied, satisfied. "And perhaps someone wished his last judgment to have a witness." He let the notion hang a moment, then added, "You keep the vestry key with you at all times?" "Of course." But the Reverend said it too hastily, like a man who fears a gap has already opened beneath the foundation of his certainty. "Splendid," said Wimsey. "Then you will have no objection to showing me the lock, merely to satisfy my curiosity as an amateur enthusiast of mechanical honesty." Before the vicar could muster a protest, Wimsey was already strolling toward the chapel, hat in hand, conversation turning effortlessly to stonework, gargoyles, and parish subscription lists, the harmless chatter of a gentleman who, by all appearances, had absolutely no designs at all. Yet it was in his eyes, as faint as a cat before the pounce. Not who rang, but who wanted the bell to say it had been rung by the dead himself. That was no ornament of mourning. It was a signature. The vestry smelled of dust, candle wax, and the faint, sour breath of long-abandoned hymnals. The vicar, fumbling slightly with self-conscious dignity, produced the small brass key from his waistcoat and fitted it into the first of the locks. It turned, reluctantly, though not rusted. The second was a heavier affair, wrought iron and officious about its age. When that one yielded, the door opened with a tired sigh. Inside, a narrow alcove housed the bell mechanism's counterweight coil and a small wooden chest fixed to the wall. Locked, of course, wherein the second key was presumably kept when not in the Colonel's pocket. The rope, neatly braided and weathered by decades of winter damp and funeral tolls, ascended upward into darkness. Wimsey regarded it not as an object but as a gesture, the way one regards a calling card left too pointedly. "You observe," said Markham, a touch defensively, "that nothing is disturbed?" "On the contrary," Wimsey replied mildly. "I observe that everything appears too undisturbed. Disorder is the honest companion of human use. When one finds immaculate stillness, one suspects maintenance of a deliberate kind." The vicar frowned, uncertain whether he had been complimented or accused. Wimsey leaned in slightly, studying the key chest without touching it. "And how often, Reverend, does the Colonel's key come to rest here?" That is difficult to say. He seldom spoke of it." Markham's fingers fluttered uselessly at his side. He disliked interference. "So he kept his own key on his person?" "Yes, habitually. Even indoors? Always." Curious," Wimsey murmured, as though the bell were a private confidence. That earned a startled look from the clergyman, not denial, but discomfort at something too near the truth. Bunter, having concluded his quiet inspection of the hinges, stepped back without a word. Wimsey gave the vestry a last, almost casual glance, then allowed the vicar to relock the door. Once outside again, the morning light felt oddly colder. "Tell me," Wimsey said as they walked back toward the gravel, "was the Colonel a man to fear death, or to summon it?" Markham hesitated again. "He was a man," he said at last, "who believed his reckoning was overdue." "A moral reckoning?" Wimsey inquired. "A personal one," the vicar said quietly. That answer lodged itself neatly beside the widow's restraint and the servant's unease. Here was a man whose habits were not merely idiosyncrasies but containments, not piety, but sequestration. One did not lock one's praying place unless one prayed against something that must not hear. By the time Wimsey and Bunter had left the vicarage garden, a different shape of suspicion had begun to gather like slow cloud. This was no crime of sudden passion. The bell itself testified to anticipation, and anticipation required knowledge in advance. Back on the main lane, a carriage clattered toward them in a fluster of whip and reins. The groom atop it gave Wimsey a stiff little nod before calling out, "Dr. Atherton's compliments, my lord. They're asking for you back at the Hall." "Ah?" Wimsey inquired lightly. "Has the Colonel taken to conversation again?" "Not him, sir. Mrs. Hargreaves. Says she's something to be put straight before talk goes astray." Wimsey exchanged a glance with Bunter. It was not surprise he registered, merely confirmation that the wind had shifted direction exactly as expected. "Bunter," he said, "one feels Mrs. Hargreaves has spent the night rearranging memory into something resembling alibi." "Yes, my lord." "A pity for her," Wimsey went on, stepping lightly into the carriage. "That truth is never improved by tidying up. Much like a room, once everything is polished, one always sees the fingerprints most clearly." The groom cracked the reins, and the fields began gliding backward. "People do not rush to correct rumors unless they fear the wrong version may replace the useful one," Wimsey murmured, "which means something was circulating in that house before the bell ever rang. Not grief, preparation." He removed his hat, resting it loosely in his hand. "Whoever rang the bell wanted the death certified," he said, "and Mrs. Hargreaves, God bless her stoicism, wants it explained away." Bunter sat very still. He knew better than to interrupt when Lord Peter reached the edge of inference. "It is not the death that is suspect," Wimsey concluded softly, "but the announcement. Murder may have happened hours before, yet the murderer wanted the world to believe the moment was 7:30. And the widow," Bunter said quietly, "wishes us to believe something else altogether." Wimsey's smile was faint, feline. "Oh, she will tell the truth," he said, "so far as it is flattering." He settled back in the seat, eyes half-lidded in something like amusement. "But I suspect the Colonel was killed not because he feared a reckoning, but because someone feared he might finally reveal one." The carriage rattled up the gravel sweep just as two housemaids, heads together like guilty sparrows, darted away from the front steps at the sight of Wimsey's approach. Their retreat was not one of modesty, but of self-preservation. an instinct common to small birds and servants who know something they oughtn't. Inside, Mrs. Hargreaves was waiting in the morning room with the stiff, waxen air of a woman determined to be formally reasonable. She had exchanged last night's crushed brocade for something plainer, severe enough to suggest mourning without quite submitting to it. Her hair was immaculate, not a wisp mislaid. People who have slept well after a violent death rarely intend to tell the whole truth. "My lord," she said coolly, "I thought it best to speak before the village invents further embellishments. Already Mrs. Keating has sent a note, inquiring whether my husband was quite himself these last weeks, as if lunacy had begun to show through his cufflinks." "Villages are vicious out of boredom," Wimsey replied pleasantly, "not philosophy. Please do sit." She did, but with the faint reluctance of someone who preferred to stand guard over her own version of events. "I want it understood," she began, tapping one manicured finger once against her chair's arm, "that my husband was not an unbalanced man. Whatever the doctor may speculate, this business with the bell was not some symptom of guilt or superstition." Wimsey folded one leg over the other. "That is a very precise thing to deny before anyone has suggested it. A flicker, not fear, merely calculation, misfiring by a fraction. I know what curiosity does in a small parish," she said, "and I know how appearances get twisted." "Indeed," Wimsey murmured, "especially when appearances were crafted in the first place with great care." She stiffened, but only slightly. "You believe I'm hiding something," she said. "I believe everyone in this house is," Wimsey replied, still pleasantly conversational. "Your husband most of all, but the dead are terribly undisciplined liars. They forget to keep up the pretense. Their absences speak for them." She looked away, just to the left. Not evasive, but preparing, Wimsey noted it with inward satisfaction. Confessions seldom begin with truth. They begin with rehearsal collapsing. "My husband was ill," she said quietly. "Not visibly. Not in a way one could catalogue. But his past had begun to intrude." "Past events often do," Wimsey said, "especially when they have been forcefully locked away. Like a vestry." Her eyes snapped back to his face. "You've been speaking to Markham." "Only enough to see the outline of what others have been working so hard to blur," he said. For the first time, something trembled faintly in her composure. Not weakness, but the strain of a structure beginning to sag at its fault line. "You think," she breathed, "that my husband was afraid?" "No," said Wimsey gently. "I think someone else was. And fear is a much better motive for murder than torment. Torment waits. Fear takes precautions." That struck home, visibly. She inhaled, then set her jaw with new resolve. "I will tell you what I know," she said, her voice scarcely above a thread. "But not here, not where ears can flit through keyholes. There are matters in this house that were never spoken aloud, not even between us. And if you are to understand the night he died, you must understand the history he brought with him." "History," Wimsey said softly, "seldom travels alone." "No," she whispered, "and it never stays buried." He rose, offering his arm. She hesitated, then took it with the air of someone stepping toward a scaffold built by memory rather than law. As they crossed the hall toward her late husband's study, the grandfather clock told the half-hour, not dissonant, merely punctual, and Wimsey had the sudden, unmistakable feeling that they were walking not into testimony, but onto a stage where the first curtain had at last been drawn aside. Somewhere in this house, the truth was already waiting, and unlike the Colonel, it did not intend to stay locked behind any door. She led him not to the study, which would have been conventional, but to a narrower passage behind the principal staircase, a servant's corridor that did not seem to suit a lady of her rank. The walls there were lined with hooks for cloaks and lanterns, and the floor held an older, more primitive chill than elsewhere in the house. Wimsey noted it at once. a passage not meant for guests nor for the master, an artery of housekeeping and secrets. "My husband seldom came this way," she murmured, her voice lowered, though no one seemed present. "But it begins here. This part of the house is original, older than the rest. The hall was nearly doubled in size by his grandfather. Only this wing remains untouched." "Ah," Wimsey said lightly, "the architectural conscience. One always leaves a little ruin standing for historical flavor, like an unwanted relative kept alive to avoid scandal." She gave no smile, but her steps slowed as they reached a fire door of thick oak, iron-banded with an archaic latch polished by generations of rough hands. "He said once," she whispered, "that some houses are not improved by being modernized. They only lose their memory, and then they grow distressed." "A sentimental fellow?" "No." Her hand hovered over the latch. "An observant one." He did not press her. The silence stretched long enough for the house to seem to listen. At last she opened the door. The corridor beyond was older still, narrower, darker, its walls cold stone rather than plaster. A faint smell of extinguished fires lingered, like a chapel long abandoned to its own dust. A single lantern hung from a bracket, unlit. "He would come down here at night," she said, "only when he thought everyone asleep. I discovered it by accident. At first I believed, I hoped, it was merely a fit of nerves. But he stood in this passage for long stretches of time, staring at the far end, as though waiting for something to materialize." "And what lies at the far end?" Wimsey asked. "The old vestry," she replied, "or what used to be one. It was sealed off when the new chapel was built." Wimsey's brow flicked with interest. "Ah, yes. Colonel Purpose Gothic. Add a chapel, smother the skeleton." "You see now," she said softly, "when the bell rang." Her throat tightened. He looked toward this passage, not toward the stairs. He was terrified long before he reached the tower. "Terrified," Wimsey repeated, as though testing the grain of the word. "And yet he came." She closed her eyes a moment. "Yes, because he believed, I think, that whatever haunted him had finally come to collect its debt." "Which suggests," said Wimsey, "that the debt was no small matter." She opened her eyes again, resigned to the disclosure she had been resisting. "It wasn't madness, Lord Peter. Not the kind one treats with laudanum and country air. It was memory, sharpened into dread by something more recent, something that threatened to expose him. Expose, not punish. Yes." A breath. "I believe someone reminded him of that buried past, someone who knew precisely which string to pluck, and when." Wimsey's gaze traveled down the length of the corridor, past the unlit lantern and toward the faint, sealed doorway at its termination. The vestry, the one place in Oxford Hall still shut with real intention. "And do you believe," he asked gently, "that the hand which tugged that thread was the same that rang the bell?" Mrs. Hargreaves did not answer at once. When she spoke, her voice was scarcely sound. More a confession exhaled into stone. "I believe," she said, "that whoever killed him did not do so out of rage, but out of certainty. They were finishing something, not beginning it." Wimsey looked at her, really looked, and saw that she was not merely frightened, but bracing for the return of whatever ruin had begun. "And which part of this house," he asked very quietly, "is it that you have not yet dared to enter?" Her eyes flickered to the sealed vestry door, involuntary, betraying more than speech could. For the first time, Wimsey smiled, not lightly, but with the gleam of a hound at the first true scent. "Well then," he murmured, "shall we see whether the dead have left us a map or a witness?" Mrs. Hargreaves did not move toward the vestry door at once. Some inward caution, or superstition disguised as propriety, held her rooted. Wimsey observed the slight tension in her shoulders, the manner in which her hands had folded themselves with the air of a woman waiting for a verdict she already expects, but dreads to hear pronounced. "You need not come further, if you would rather not," he said, not unkindly. "The dead are bashful creatures. They seldom speak until the audience has thinned." Her relief was faint but visible. She inclined her head once and withdrew a half-step, as though reclaiming the respectability of distance. "I will wait in the morning room," she murmured. "There are things I must consider, but if you intend to examine it, you will need the key." She produced it from a narrow chain around her neck, slim, old-fashioned, with a Gothic bow and a bit worn thin by time. Not her key, then. His. Wimsey accepted it with a soft nod. "How long has it been sealed?" "The better part of 40 years, she said. "Long before my marriage. His father had it closed very suddenly and would never permit it reopened. Something to do with a scandal in the parish, but whenever I asked, there was always some convenient vagueness, as though the thing were not merely forgotten, but erased." "Erasure," Wimsey murmured, "is always a labor of intent." She left him then, her footsteps receding along the stone corridor, the sharp clicks of her heels turning muted as she reached the carpeted hall beyond. When the great oak door fell gently shut behind her, the silence congealed, older than death, older even than guilt, a silence that remembered what living witnesses would not. Wimsey walked the passage slowly, eyes narrowed not in dread but in appraisal. The lantern hook bore a smear. Soot? No, not soot. Candle grease. Recent, faint, but unmistakably modern. Someone else had been here in the last weeks, and not for architectural admiration. At the vestry door he paused. A draught exhaled through the keyhole. Not the pleasant cold of stonework, but the stale confinement of a room that had kept its breath too long. He inserted the key, turned it gently, and felt not resistance but a lethargic surrender of the lock. When he pushed, the hinges protested with a groan, like a sleeper waked unwilling from dreams. The room beyond was low-vaulted, older than the rest of the wing. Monastic stone rather than manor architecture. No furniture but a narrow prayer desk and a wall of boarded paneling where some former fixture had been violently removed. A faint trace of incense lingered, impossibly persistent, or else recently reintroduced. There was dust, but not as much as 40 undisturbed years would yield. And there, in the dust, the most telling thing of all. Footprints. Not many, but distinct. A man's, by the size. 2 sets. One old, one only days recent, and the newest prints did not stop at the threshold. They led to the paneling at the far wall, hesitated, then turned back sharply, as though something had startled the trespasser before his purpose was finished. Wimsey bent low, studying the impressions. The stride was measured, not fearful, until the return, then narrower, faster, a retreat, not an exit. He straightened and regarded the boards along the far wall. A faint crack ran down one seam, a door once hidden, now sealed, or not entirely sealed. The colonel had come here. Not once, more than once. Long enough to wear a faint path in dust that should have lain lifeless, and whoever followed him here had come after the bell began to toll. Wimsey let out a slow breath. "So," he murmured to the shadows, "we begin not with death, but with resurrection, of memory, if nothing else." He took one step toward the paneling, then stopped abruptly, not from fear, but from new calculation. Because the breeze he had felt at the threshold was stronger here, an almost imperceptible current drawn from some place behind the wood. A breathing cavity or a concealed chamber. Not sealed then, merely waiting, which meant someone else knew of it, and had reason to keep it known only half open. Wimsey's smile sharpened, cat-like. "Not a ghost then," he said under his breath, "a custodian. And custodians, unlike spirits, can be caught." He laid a gloved hand against the panel, not to force it, but to listen through his fingertips. The wood thrummed faintly, not with hollow resonance, but with the subtle give of something that had been opened and closed, often enough to remember the motion. The grain had been rubbed smoother in one place, just at the level of a man's shoulder. A touch that had become routine, not exploratory. Someone, then, entered here habitually. The colonel had not merely been haunted. He had been summoned. Wimsey's eyes lowered to the floor again, following the retreating prints. They did not return straight to the door, but veered toward the corner, where a dark, long-dried droplet trail speckled the stone. Not blood, but candle wax. Someone had come prepared for darkness. Someone not content with rumor, but seeking verification. He stooped, tracing the hardened bead with a fingertip. "Practical," he murmured, and frightened enough to fumble. He rose slowly, letting his gaze wander up the walls. A crucifix had once hung there. One could still see the faint ghost shadow of its shape, the stone bleached around absence. But what captured his attention was a second, far subtler impression. Not on the wall, but scored lightly into the lower molding, a mark left by something dragged, narrow and long, over and over. Not furniture. Something lighter. A staff, a stick, a walking cane. That fit none of the colonel's habits. Wimsey drew a slow breath through his teeth. "Not merely a visitor," he murmured. "A pilgrim." He returned to the panel and pressed lightly at the smooth point. It shifted a fraction, not a hinge but a catch, enough to confirm the mechanism, but he did not attempt to open it fully. That would be premature. Better, far better, to know who still used the hidden way and how recently. Instead, he stepped backward and let the panel settle again, restoring the room to its semblance of slumber. Whoever came here in secret had not expected discovery. And fear makes people clumsy only after they know they are hunted. When he turned away, he paused once more at the threshold, studying the more recent set of tracks. They were not the colonel's. The colonel's shoes, from the pair in the dressing room upstairs, had a distinctive heel pattern. These bore a flatter sole, more utilitarian. A servant's boot, perhaps, or a villager's work shoe. Someone accustomed to hidden labor, not polished entrances. And there, just at the edge of the frame, an infinitesimal scuff of soil. Not garden soil, but darker, clay-thick, the sort found in riverbeds. Oxford Hall stood nowhere near a river. He locked the vestry door behind him once more, pocketing the key with casual finality. Whoever expected silence would, for the moment, still believe in it. When he emerged back into the sunlighted hall, his expression was pleasantly idle, as though he had merely been admiring architectural oddities. Mrs. Hargreaves had not returned, but a footman hovered at the far end of the corridor, uncomfortably still, as if waiting to be dismissed from a post he had not been told to occupy. Wimsey strolled toward him with the slow, unthreatening gait of a man who has just solved nothing at all. "I say, my good fellow," he drawled lightly, "the river that runs nearest the estate. It lies to the south, yes?" The footman blinked, startled. "There is no river on the estate, my lord." "Not on, no, but one not far off." "Only the Fenwick waterway, sir. 4 miles off. Nasty place. The groundsmen don't go near it." "Don't they?" Wimsey murmured, eyes half-lidded. "How sensible of them." He left the fellow baffled and turned toward the morning room, thoughts clicking inward like a lock sliding toward alignment. 40 years sealed. And yet the dust was younger than fear, the tracks younger still. Something, or someone, had been kept alive behind reverence and disuse. Not a ghost. A witness. And witnesses, unlike relics, have the extremely awkward tendency of still being able to name the guilty. Mrs. Hargreaves had not resumed her seat in the morning room, but stood by the window, one gloved hand braced lightly against the casement, as though she required the glass to steady her. She turned when Wimsey, entered, searching his expression with a composure that was no longer quite composed. "You found something," she said. Not a question. "I found," Wimsey replied mildly, "that your vestry leads a more active life than your architect intended." Her breath caught, the faintest tremor betraying both recognition and dread. "Then you believe me?" "About his fear?" "Oh, I believe he feared something, madam. The question is whom, and since when?" She looked away, struggling with a calculation of how much to tell. Wimsey waited, politely, but with the unmistakable air of a man who already knows the remainder and is merely choosing whether to confirm or embarrass. At last she spoke, low but steady. "There was a letter 3 weeks ago. No name, no signature, only a single line, handwritten, and nothing else." "And the contents?" She hesitated, but not long enough to be theatrically reluctant. "It said, 'You cannot bury what breathes.'" Wimsey's brows lifted, but only faintly. "Ah, not remorse, then. Leverage." She nodded once. "He burned it," she said. "Or I believe he did. He would not let me see it twice. But from that night on, he never slept through until morning. And 2 days later, he began keeping a candle in his study again and visiting that corridor at midnight." A breath. "Like a penitent dragged to his own altar. And he spoke of none of this to you? He believed, or wished me to believe, that it was some old parish dispute being stirred up by a crank. But he watched the post anxiously, and when no second letter came, he grew worse. He did not drink, he did not rave, he simply waited. For something he knew would not remain written," Wimsey finished quietly. She looked up at him, startled by the precision. But he did not elaborate. "Tell me," he continued lightly, "in your long acquaintance with your husband, did you ever observe him show tenderness for anything lost? A former friend, a disgraced acquaintance, a debt he regretted but dared not pay?" The pause was telling, because it was not one of perplexity, but of painful recognition. "There was one man," she said slowly, "before our marriage. A scandal never spoken of plainly, but rumored heavily. Something to do with the parish before the old vestry was sealed. His father dismissed the matter as a charity gone sour. But there were whispers that the vicar's curate disappeared. Vanished, Wimsey echoed softly, but not buried." Her silence was answer enough. "I must ask you one more thing," he said almost gently. "In the weeks before his death, did your husband go into the village alone?" "Yes," she murmured. "Twice that I know of. Once very early in the morning, before breakfast, and once after dark. When he returned, he refused supper, and he locked his study." "Quite so," Wimsey breathed. Something in his tone made her draw back a fraction, not fear, but dawning comprehension that his line of thought was running somewhere she herself had never looked. "You think," she said softly, "that he met someone?" "Oh, I should say he met someone again," Wimsey replied. "For if the past resurrects itself with handwriting, the next step is rarely the pen. It is the voice, the personal reminder." He saw her throat tighten. "And if a reminder speaks," he added gently, "it means the past still has a mouth that breathes." Outside the tall windows, a rook let out a harsh, cracked caw, not unlike a rusty hinge on a crypt door, and the sound seemed to drive a pale shiver along her spine. Wimsey reached absently for his cigarette case, more for punctuation than use. "Your husband," he said almost idly, "was not running from a ghost, Mrs. Hargreaves. He was arranging an audience. The only question now is whether he succeeded, or whether the visitor grew impatient." She stared at him. "You believe the killer came to the hall before the night of the bell?" He gave her a look at once mild and razor-sharp. "My dear lady," he said, flicking open the case with a soft click, "I believe the killer never left." Wimsey's gaze lingered on the rope as though it were a rather impolite guest who had overstayed its welcome. At last he straightened, dusted a fleck of mortar from his cuff, and said lightly, "A noose conveniently to hand in the belfry. How very industrious. Either our murderer had a distinctly agricultural sense of decor, or he expected to make repeat use of it." Bunter cleared his throat in a way that was practically a telegram. "My lord, the fibres you requested have been packed. There is also a smear of some whitish substance adhering to the inner coil. Quite tenacious. Shall I collect a sample?" "Pray do," Wimsey murmured. "The dead are remarkably informative when one resists the urge to tidy them away." He cast another look about the lean-to gloom of the belfry chamber. Our assailant arranges, waits, strikes, and vanishes, yet leaves his equipment on display. Not the act of a nervous amateur. This is someone confident he won't be discovered by accident. "Trusted access," Bunter supplied crisply. "Trusted and invisible," Wimsey agreed. "One whom no one sees because he has always been there." He let that hang a moment. Not a deduction yet, merely a direction in which the wind was beginning, faintly, to blow. They left the tower slowly, Wimsey pausing to note the scuffs near the threshold, the faint drag mark where something light but bulky had passed over the stone. No attempt to conceal it. That was nearly as curious as the rope itself, every effect theatrical but never overplayed. A showman with restraint. One could almost admire the taste, were the subject not homicide. Outside, dusk was collapsing quietly over the churchyard. The Yews looked like watchmen who had decided long ago they would rather witness wickedness than interrupt it. Wimsey pushed his hands into his coat pockets, strolling toward the rectory as though he were merely late for tea. "Bunter, what strikes you as most peculiar? The weapon, the staging, the absence of haste, or the sheer courtesy of leaving the instrument so neatly coiled?" "The absence of alarm afterwards, my lord," Bunter replied. "Whoever did this was not interrupted. He neither feared discovery nor attempted subterfuge. He acted as if the bell tower belonged to him." "Exactly." Wimsey's voice held a mild spark of satisfaction. When a man does not worry about being seen, it is because he believes he will not be questioned. One is invisible in two ways, by insignificance or by authority, and I do not think our murderer is insignificant. They reached the rectory gate. Wimsey slowed a fraction, his head turning toward the darkening lane where the verger had walked earlier that afternoon, flustered and unhelpfully pious. Not fearful, merely anxious to be thought helpful. If he were guilty, he would have done better to appear faintly stupid. No, the air pointed elsewhere. Someone with a longer tether to the church's workings. Someone entitled to be there at odd hours. Someone to whom keys were no novelty. The difficulty lay not in narrowing the field, but in believing the conclusion. "Tomorrow," Wimsey said lightly, as though arranging a picnic, "I shall require a look at the vestry registers, the bell ringer's rota, and anything the church wardens keep locked away on the assumption that it must therefore be uninteresting. Most of the world's mischief is committed under precisely that assumption. And in the meantime, my lord." "In the meantime," Wimsey smiled faintly, "we shall allow our murderer to believe the evening has gone his way. The confident man always overplays his hand once he presumes he is safe." They stepped into the yellowed hall lamp glow of the rectory, and the quiet click of the door latch behind them sounded not unlike a theatre curtain being drawn before the next act. The rector greeted them in the hall with an air of forced pastoral calm that did not sit entirely comfortably upon him. It was the look of a man trying very hard not to think of a corpse swinging over sacred stonework. Wimsey let him speak. There was a well-meaning inquiry about progress, a strained hope that the matter might be already clearer, and then dismissed him, politely but firmly, on the pretext of needing to give Bunter instructions. When the door shut and the footsteps faded, only then did Wimsey stroll toward the fire with the slow, thinking gait of a man rearranging suspects like chessmen. "It is too neat," he remarked at last, leaning one elbow along the mantelpiece. "Too contained. Murders in small parishes are not tidy. They sprawl, they leak secrets, they rattle nerves, and the guilty perspire even while protesting innocence. But here, no scent of panic, only the faintest tremor of inconvenience. Bunter, who was stowing his sample case, did not look up. You believe the stillness is orchestrated? Orchards do not harvest themselves, Bunter. Someone is shaking the tree and hoping the fruit will fall in a direction of his choosing. His eyes narrowed slightly. Our victim, after all, did not simply die. He was removed, placed, selected. Someone chose both his death and his staging, and that speaks not of rage, nor fear, nor sudden opportunity, but purpose. He moved from the fire to the window, lifting the curtain just enough to see the lamplit path beyond. The lane was deserted. Still, he watched it as though he expected the dark itself to confess. "Tomorrow will tell us whether this is a question of guardianship or trespass," he continued, voice lowered. "Whether the murderer is a wolf who slipped in or the shepherd who never left." Bunter shut the case with a quiet snap. "If I may, my lord, there is also the matter of Miss Parmenter. She has been markedly uneasy since word reached her. Not shocked, precisely. Unsettled, as though weighing consequences rather than misfortune." Wimsey's eyebrows ticked upward. "Ah, uneasy before the investigation rather than because of it. That is always instructive." He tapped a finger against the sill. "She has keys as well, does she not? Choir supervision, vestry access, preparatory duties. Yes, yes." His tone was thoughtful, rather than accusatory. "And she is precisely the sort of person a murderer might rely upon to notice nothing, unless she has already noticed altogether too much." He let the curtain fall, turning back into the room. "We shall speak to her tomorrow, discreetly. A careful prod in the right nerve and something will twitch. Truth is a beast easily startled if one knows where to tap the cage." The rectory clock struck the quarter hour, its gentle chime sounding curiously watchful. Wimsey listened to it fade, then drawled with deceptive indolence. "I do not yet know the motive, Bunter, only the contour of it. It has the shape of a secret that has lived comfortably for rather a long time until someone threatened to turn a key in the dark." He smiled, thin and thoughtful. "And secrets, once endangered, ceased to lie still." He did not sleep long, nor heavily. The bells, those same bells that had given the corpse its grotesque theatre, had an unnerving way of entering one's dreams, mutating there into strange tolls of judgment and warning. At dawn, Wimsey rose, shaved, and stepped out into the thin, pale light of a morning that felt too hushed even for the countryside. Bunter joined him shortly after, immaculate as ever, though his glance at the steeple betrayed the faintest distaste for ecclesiastical melodrama before breakfast. The churchyard was empty. Frost still clung in curled white crescents on the grass where the sun had not yet reached. Wimsey pushed open the vestry door and stood just inside, listening. Nothing. No footsteps, no rustle of vestments, no whisper of rehearsed piety. He crossed the flagstones to the bell tower stair, running one gloved hand along the cold rail. Then he paused. "Bunter," he said quietly, "note the lock. It has been oiled recently. Very recently. You observe the residue on the hinge." Bunter crouched, examining it with professional reserve. "Aye, my lord. And rather too liberally applied, if I may say. Someone in haste, or unused to doing the thing themselves. And not done by the church caretaker, I think. Routine maintenance is careful, sparing, neat. This is panic mitigation." He straightened. "Our murderer needed silence where there had been squeal, lest a late-night trespass be heard." His smile was slight, analytical. "That tells us not merely guilt, but confidence. A person with keys, accustomed enough to the premises to anticipate the risk." He ascended a few steps and stopped again. The rope now hung coiled and harmless as any farm tool, yet in his mind's eye he could still see the awful arc of a body dropping where it had no right to be. "Bunter," he murmured, This was no afterthought. The staging was meant to be seen, meant to be found. The bells were not merely a vantage, they were the message. He came down again, passing back through the vestry. Miss Parmenter, I think, first. She will be at the rectory schoolroom this morning. Children's choir practice, if the rector's timetable is to be trusted. I should like to see how her nerves sit in their natural habitat. They emerged into the churchyard path once more. A mild breeze stirred the yew branches overhead, making a dry whisper that sounded almost like something breathing. And afterward, Wimsey added lightly, as though mentioning nothing of consequence, "We shall trouble ourselves about the alibi of one Mr. Fallow, whose curious capacity for being almost near anywhere is beginning to suggest the strategic geography of a man who prefers to be noticed only enough to appear harmless." Bunter inclined his head. "And if he proves less harmless than he seems?" Wimsey's eyes glinted, keen and amused. "Then we have found a fox wearing the expression of a hedgerow." He took a last glance at the bell tower, no sentiment, only appraisal, then turned toward the lane. "Come, Bunter, let us go prod the choir's conscience. One always learns something instructive when one listens to who sings on key and who suddenly finds their throat mysteriously dry."